Good evening, and welcome to the Harwood Museum of Art. My name is Gwendolyn Fernandez. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at the Harwood. Tonight's program is part of our Harwood 100 Centennial celebrations. And as we as an institution look back on 100 years of history as a cultural institution here in Taos, our team is taking a close look at the narratives and practices embedded in our history and charting a course for change in the 100 years ahead. Come on in, grab a seat. So for the Centennial exhibition, our Curator of Exhibitions and Collections, Nicole Dao-Kay, secured a significant loan, bringing Ernest Blumenshine's Taos Neighbors and Friends back to New Mexico. And with it, an opportunity to revisit the complex relationship between the Taos Society of Artists and the Taos community at large. We could think of no better person to engage in this dialogue with us than Dr. Sylvia Rodriguez, who has been studying the complex histories of tourism, race, and culture in northern New Mexico for over 40 years. We are grateful that she is returning to the Harwood to offer new insights on her research many decades after delivering her first paper on the subject right here in this museum. Before I hand things over to Dr. Rodriguez, I want to thank a few of the major donors who have made this work possible. That includes the Henry Luce Foundation, Marianne Evans, Joyce and Sherman Scott, 203 Fine Art, Arroyo Seco Live, and the University of New Mexico Office of Academic Affairs. I want to extend a special gratitude to New Mexico Arts for supporting tonight's program and many of our Centennial programs. I have just a few housekeeping notes before I hand things over. The museum will remain open for 30 minutes following tonight's talk, so you can visit the exhibition and see some of the works that are discussed tonight. Please also come back for more programs up ahead. We have a busy December. We'll have Lighting Ladue, our annual holiday tradition, on December 1st. The museum will be open and free. We'll have activities for kids and all things happening up and down the street, performances. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're also hosting 3 nights of classical music with the Taos Chamber Music Group and a film screening with Taos Poet Laureate Joshua Concha for a new film that he has produced, which we're doing in partnership with Somos. All the details are on our website, and if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, that's always the best way to find out what's happening. Or sign up, become a member, and we'd love to see you back often. And get a nice 10% discount in the gift shop. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our brilliant speaker for this evening. Dr. Sylvia Rodriguez is a native Taoseña, Professor Emerita of Anthropology, and former director of the Alfonso Ortiz Center for Intercultural Studies at the University of New Mexico. She has conducted ethnographic research in Taos and northern New Mexico for over 4 decades and published books and articles about interethnic relations, tourism, ritual and identity, place, and conflict over land and water. Please welcome Dr. Rodriguez.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. I'm going to try to fit a lot into a little amount of time. First, let me say a little bit about who I am, so that might help you forgive me for what I'm going to tell you tonight. Yeah?
A little louder if you could, please.
Oh, wait. Oh, this is the mic. Sorry, Robin, did I just mess up your recording? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, as Gwen said, I grew up in Taos. Part of my family's been here for a long time. My mother came here in the 30s, running from upper middle class white culture in Austin to embrace a bohemian life here in Taos. Like so many people, escaped and fell in love with my father. And they married and crossed the lines. Their marriage in the 1930s crossed the lines in many ways, giving birth to 2 coyote daughters who have each lived against the grain one way or another. But like so many people of my generation, I have a deep connection to the Harwood. It's one of these iconic buildings. I mean, Taos has a number of iconic adobe structures. Obviously, the most iconic of all is the Taos Pueblo, but there's also the Ranchos Church. But thinking about the Harwood, it too, even though it's gone through a lot of physical changes from the days when it was the library, and I spent many hours in the library and checked out many books from the library. And my parents, when they were first married, lived on Ladue Street, which is, I guess, sort of Taos's version of Canyon Road in a way. And they had many stories about life at the Harwood and about Lucy Kay's Harwood, who gave my mother a recipe, and about the terrible violent fights that Frank and Janie Waters had when they were both living upstairs at the Harwood, and all the artists. And I grew up knowing my father had a store in town. My parents knew everybody in town. My mother knew every queer in town. She was very bohemianly oriented. My father had a drugstore, so he knew many people's secrets. And of course, that was when the plaza was really the heart of town. And all the action was right there on the plaza and the courthouse, and the gossip was wonderful. And that all changed, when they put the courthouse on the South Pueblo Road, and the whole thing became gentrified. And now the plaza, of course, is the hollowed out heart of what was once the place of Taos. And I've written about that too. I have a lot of associations with this place. For 20 years, I had a field station in what's now the consulting or the conference room of the Harwood, which was part of the deal when I was recruited from UCLA to come back to UNM, and they couldn't meet my salary, which was, like all salaries, better than those that you get in New Mexico. And I said, I need a place in Taos where I can have a base. And so for 20 years, I worked out of that place, and that was my little office there in town. So there are a lot of associations with the Harwood. 40 years ago, when I was just starting my research, somehow, and I'm not quite sure how I got in on it, David Witt, who was then a curator here at the Harwood, organized a conference on the history of the art colony. And I had barely begun my work. This must have been 1980-81. I just gotten my degree, and had all these ideas about what I wanted to study in Taos, which really came out of my own experience of trying to figure out, who am I? Where did I come from? What's going on in this place? And after having worked in Mesoamerica and found out that I thought it was sort of politically untenable for an American to be doing research in the third world, I said, oh, well, I'll come home. There won't be the same issues. But of course there were, and I've wrestled with those ever since. But 4 years ago, David organized this conference on the art colony. So somehow, I decided to give a paper on something that had been brewing for a long time, and it was motivating my work. And it was not in this didn't exist then. It was, I think, in one of the front galleries, and it was a small affair, and it was actually the earliest draft of the paper that you see the title to, which was one of the first publications on Taos that I did, which was back in 1989. And I said, and I'll be covering some of that and more than I did at that meeting. And my cousin Juanita's not here tonight. She couldn't bear to come, but she recalled something that I had forgotten, which was when I read my paper, David Witt freaked out. David Witt was very upset because he thought what I was saying was inappropriate. I had also forgotten, even perhaps more significantly, that who else was in the audience was Lois Rudnick. Who do you know who Lois Rudnick was? She died just a couple of years ago. Lois was at that time also a young scholar starting out, and she was doing her dissertation on Mabel Dodge Lujan. And of course that later became a very famous book. And I think Lois did 3 books, and this talk is dedicated partly to Lois and partly to Jim Bodine, who I'll get to in a minute. But anyway, Lois, who a few years ago organized an extravaganza to celebrate her 3rd book on Mabel, which took years for her to write because the secret archives of Mabel Dodge were housed at the Yale Library, and they weren't released until a certain date after her death. And of course, the first person in line was Lois, and it was all about syphilis. And it was called the Syphilis Papers, the secret of Mabel Dodge, because she had syphilis and Tony gave it to her. And in fact, it was everywhere. It was like AIDS, the AIDS of its time. But I'd forgotten that Lois freaked out. But when she gave her extravaganza a few years ago, and there was a special exhibit here at the Harwood, and a book came out of it, some of you may remember, that was all about Mabel and the relationship to the Harwood. And you know, Lois was a very exuberant person. And she just went all out, and she had a panel. And she asked me to be on the panel with a couple of other people. And at that panel, she reminded me that she had also freaked out at that conference. And I didn't remember that. I'm amazed. You know, I was probably so nervous that I didn't remember anything. But I thought it was interesting. The thing about Lois is that she was horrified. She was scandalized by what I had to say about the art colony and about race relations in Taos. But she did, as a good scholar, come to realize that I was right. And it was partly through the persuasion of Marta Weigel, who was a mutual colleague and a dear friend who was a very important scholar of New Mexico, by and by convinced Lois that maybe she ought to think about what I was saying. And she did, and in her subsequent book, she acknowledged me as being right, but I think it was always graded against Lois. But Lois was responsible, really, I think, for making Mabel into a feminist hero, starting with the publication of her book. And let's see. So, anyway, I am revisiting this occasion to reflect on what I was talking about and sort of all that's come since. And let me see, if I get carried away, I forget to. Yeah, so there we go. History on the art colony. Okay, when I was a senior in college, by accident, I came across a little article which was written for a conference by a guy named Jim Bodine. And I remember hearing the name Jim Bodine around town, but I never really met him. And it was this little paper called Triethnic Trap, the Spanish Americans of Taos. And it's not a well-known article. And I read that article, and it hit me like a bolt of lightning. It was the only thing I had ever read about Taos that was true. And what Jim Bodine was saying in the triethnic trap, I want to distinguish between the triethnic myth and the triethnic trap. And Jim Bodine is gone now. He was an anthropologist. Lois was not an anthropologist. He became dean of at American University in Washington. And he continued to be a very kind of under the radar specialist on Taos Pueblo. And of course, for an anthropologist to be a specialist on Taos Pueblo and to advertise that as a kind of suicide mission, which I won't go into. He had some kin connection at Taos Pueblo. And I'm not sure what it is, but I was recently, he didn't publish a lot. This is the picture of his dissertation, which is attitudes at Taos Pueblo, which is now, there are several books on Taos Pueblo that if they're in a public library, they disappear. And sometimes perhaps they're burned. But anyway, it was, it's kind of old-fashioned. It's a little out of date, like a triethnic trap paper. But he talks about having known Taos Pueblo and lived at Taos Pueblo as a child. And so he had some connection to that. I later got to know Jim many years later, and he was a wonderful guy. And unfortunately, just as he was ready to retire, he died. And he left his papers at one of the museums here in Taos, and God knows what's happened to them. But he wrote this based on his observations in Taos. And the triethnic myth, I think we all know, which is this, that there are these three major groups that live in harmony, and that there's this complex relationship among them, but in the end, Taos is wonderful because we all get along, and it's this great thing. And it's really, even though it's triethnic, the Anglo part is always sort of, we really don't need to talk about that because, we don't need to because it's really the Indians who are interesting, and the Mexicans we sort of have mixed feelings about. But anyway, he talked about this triethnic trap, in a sense in which, and I think this is true, it was true when Bodine wrote this in 1968, it was true when I gave this paper, and unfortunately I think it's still true, and I think it's sort of the dilemma I want to present you with, which is the trap, which is the creature of imagination that the art promoted. And this notion that I think is pervasive, not only in Taos and in Santa Fe, about the nature of Native Americans, the nature of, well, are we going to call them Mexicans? Are we going to call them Mexican Americans? Are we going to call them Spanish Americans? Are we going to call them Hispanos? Are we going to call them La Raza? Or now, are we going to call them Latinx, which is not a term that's going to catch on here in Taos anytime soon, I don't think. But anyway, I would sort of flesh out the triethnic trap using pictures, which is really how they started. And so here we are. Okay, this is Redneck. These are Lois's books, which are all probably, like my own, available in bookstores here in Taos. This is the biography of Mabel, and I think it really did put Mabel into, like, as a feminist heroine in the 1980s and 1990s. And of course, Lois loved Mabel and didn't know her, of course, and recognized, what a difficult personality she was, but she was captured by the image of Mabel. And then she did a book about the house, which is another, not as universally recognized, but another iconic building that Mabel created halfway between the Pueblo and the town, where she brought all of the Illuminati of her generation to interpret Taos and to save and be saved by Taos Pueblo. And she goes to the period where Hopper, owned the house, and then later when the Oteros had it and had an educational thing. And of course now it's a bed and breakfast, right? So anyway, and there's Mabel, there's Lois, I think when the whole extravaganza took place, holding court there in the kitchen, or in the dining room with Mabel. Now let me get to background here. There are 5 things that I think are really important to understand about New Mexico. There are 5 factors. And I always, when I talk about New Mexico, this is what we need to think about, because it frames everything that I'm going to say. First of all, and this is not news, it's arid. It's a desert. But that's true of this whole Southwest. I mean, if you take the map of North America and you draw a line right down the middle, and that's the 100th meridian, it's green on the east side, and it's brown and dry on the west side. And of course, Wallace Stegner publicized that in his book on the 100th meridian. But the fact is, in an arid environment, everything is centered on water. And it's like everywhere, the relationship to water and how people organize their relationship to water and how they distribute it, I think is the key in every society, but we don't always think of that. It's hydrocentric. I have a hydrocentric view, actually, that even obliterates my view of the triethnic trap, but I think they are connected in some deep way. But anyway, I think if you grow up in an arid environment, in a water-scarce environment, you have a completely different mindset. If you grow up in a green place where often the issue is too much water. So from Paleo-Indian times through the pre-colonial, through the colonial, through the Mexican, to the modern day, water is the bottom line. And it's becoming increasingly obvious as we speak. The second thing about the history of this place is colonialism. And that is, of course, the famous fact that this is conquered, or actually I was corrected by a Taos Pueblo elder once I gave a talk on history, and he was asked to give a quick history, and afterwards he came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Don't use the word conquest when you're talking about Taos Pueblo." And I realized he was right, and I backed down, and I said, "You're right," because I've never ever considered the people of Taos Pueblo a conquered people. They are not a conquered people. But in any case, colonialism did change everything. It was certainly a question of subordination, successive waves of conquest and colonization, subordination, conversion, dispossession. Not exactly genocide here, but certainly an enormous reduction of population through violence and exploitation, as well as through disease that people had no resistance to. And then, of course, there's the American conquest of the emergent nation of Mexico. Mexico was not an empire. Mexico was an empire before the Europeans got there, the Mexica, but it was crushed, of course, and that was a conquest. But anyway, the whole transformation that takes place in 1847, pushed by the whole ideology of manifest destiny, in which the mestizo peoples, the indigenizing mestizo peoples, were basically converted into a race in the Euro-American or the American race system, and demoted from being sort of the white people before that, although of course they weren't white, right? I mean, the whole limpieza de sangre thing, the Spanish brought and instituted a casta system which categorized racial types and every conceivable mixture. It was not exactly a race-free ideology, although of course we could go into all of the creation of race and white supremacy in the United States, and that's been a lot of talk about that. Now, of course, they're burning those books, not been kicking out scholars who are talking about it. But anyway, this is part of our history. And Mexico is not an empire here. It's basically an emergent nation that is gets half its territories sucked up and incorporated into the United States as the United States spreads westward with the ideology of manifest destiny and decides to turn the desert, which the Mexicans weren't quite up to really turning into a garden, but turning it into a garden. And this changed everything, of course, once again. So the system, the reason that colonization, I think, is so important is because what it does is it establishes a racial hierarchy. I mean, colonialism, let's see, I'm getting carried away. I'm supposed to be, okay, colonialism. The whole racial hierarchy. I mean, the triethnic myth is actually a triethnic hierarchy. And the trap is the kind of configuration, the psychosocial configuration that we're all locked into as a result of how it went down in New Mexico. And that has to do with one of the other factors. The other factor that's really important is the border. The creation of the border, of course, by the Mexican-American War. And we don't really think of ourselves really on the border here because we're up in northern New Mexico, but this is a borderlands. This is a contact zone. And of course, the border, before it was established by American conquest, people were flowing back and forth all the time, and we still do. People still flow back and forth all the time. And the separation between the Mexicanos who were up here and the Mexicanos who ended up south of the border is, I think, often exaggerated. And that's also a whole complicated story. But the fact is we are a borderland. And the fact is that it's a permeable border, and many of us, our families move back and forth across all the time. And it's another thing that has been erased partly here is the Mexican national presence and its incredible importance to the society of Taos. Then there's tourism, which is really becomes a factor with the railroad in the late 1800s, the coming of the railroad, which opens up the West to tourist practice, and which is basically, I mean, we just had a whole thing on tourism being revisited here, and you know, how can we make tourism better? There was never any question of maybe we should rethink tourism altogether, but you know, I mean, we're stuck with tourism, so it seems. But what has tourism done to us? And what has it done to our sense of who we are? And what has it done to the racial interrelationships? And then the other thing that we don't talk about much at all, which is the other factor, is that this is a nuclear colony. And we don't always we don't in fact talk about it much at all. In fact, if you all saw the movie Oppenheimer, what's not in there? This is all about what's not in there, right? Actually, there's a brilliant young scholar named Raya Gomez who has just published a book called Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, which is the story of her family and the workers Los Alamos and what happened to them, and the legacy of cancer, and the sort of erasure of that aspect of the nuclear economy, which is actually the most powerful force in New Mexico, but you wouldn't know it. And I think that the relationship between power and invisibility, I think, is something that it comes up when we talk about the nuclear economy. I'm not going to go into that, but anyway, those are the 5 things that I think you need to really think about if you want to understand what goes on here. So here's colonial and tourism and art. When I first started studying tourism, I just thought it was, well, it's just a form of colonialism. There's just no question about it. You've got the triethnic myth, which is, of course, what we sell, and then there's the triethnic trap, which is what we're caught in, and we can't seem to escape, even in our own heads. And, of course, the coming of the artists by railroad, the famous origin myth of the art colony, the broken wheel outside of Cuesta, Sharp and Phillips and Blumenschein coming and living here part-time and then establishing themselves, and then other artists coming all before Mabel gets here. And using their paintings. Fred Harvey commissions them to do these incredible paintings to promote tourism. And so many of their paintings were actually commercial art and illustrations that were meant to turn what actually is a desert, a backwater, a racially segregated and hierarchical low economy place where it's really hard to make a living, to turn it into the land of enchantment. It's the conversion of all of these sort of, in fact, deficits in many ways into these wondrous assets that can be marketed as tourism. And I think that's really an incredible accomplishment. That original paper, in a way, Art, Tourism, Race Relationship, was a kind of case study in what Marx calls mystification. And so I won't go into that lecture, but anyway, so what's colonialism? Well, it's a group that's outside, comes in and subjugates another group and takes their territory and institutes an extractive industry, an extractive economy, and subordinates the labor of the conquered people. And of course, that's what the Spanish did here, and that's what the Americans have since done, and using different kinds of tools, but it's the same kind of structure. And what is a colony? Well, a colony is the group of the people who come in and establish their control, and then in some sense domesticate and colonize the population, the place, the resources to serve them and export all that back to the metropole, right, which is the real place. So what is tourism? We all take it for granted, and I think if you grow up in Taos, and the longer you've been here, the sort of more ambivalent you are about it, right? And I started out thinking, well, it's just colonialism, but it's so much more complicated than that. Anthropology, of course, was based on the study of so-called non-Western, primitive, non-literate peoples who were as far away and as exotic as possible. When I first did my fieldwork and I came back and I realized, Taos is just as exotic and troubling and colonized as any of these other places. I mean, why should I go to New Guinea when all this stuff is happening right here? The anthropologist Levi Strauss once said, well, what can anthropologists do to study modernity? Since what we're traditionally studying is the pre-modern. And this guy named, I'll think of his name, it's a brilliant book on the tour, says, well, if you were going to do an ethnography of modernity, you would study tourism, because that's modern behavior. And what is modernity? And what is tourism? And he proposes that tourism is the quest for authenticity. It is motivated by that because, now, of course, Mabel comes along in 1917 and she brings with her, and this is what Lois was always talking about, that Mabel was the quintessence of modernity. Had a salon, was very sophisticated, knew all about the armory show, knew all of the great people of her generation. But if you read her stuff, she really did, it's the urtext of the triethnic trap and of the mythos of the land of enchantment. It's just classical stuff, and it's people repeat it all the time without necessarily having read about it. So Levi Strauss suggests that, I can't think of his name.
McHale.
McHale, right? Yeah. McHale says the study of modernity, you study tourism. Because what you lose in modernity, you know, the corruption of the city and the industry, the separation from the land, it's some sense of authenticity. And so the tourist is always looking for something that's authentic. And of course, when they came out here and they saw, you know, this arid, difficult landscape with us, adobe architecture and Native Americans in situ, it just blew people's minds. And of course, Mabel thought that Taos and Taos Pueblo could save the corruption of the Western world. And that in the meantime, with her connections, you know, all East Coast power, money connections, she could also help the Native people in their struggle to keep their land, like the Bursey Bill. So, of course, Mabel invites out all of these incredible people, brilliant people of her generation, the artists, the writers. She built that house to host them here and brought them here, wanting them to interpret Taos. And many of them did. Of course, Lawrence is the one that they sell the most. So anyway, there's more to go into about tourism and different kinds of tourism and the quest for authenticity. There isn't time for that. But it's like the tourist gaze. What does the tourist see? What does the tourist want to see? And is there a difference between what middle-class tourists and working-class tourists see and want to see? These are all questions we can't answer tonight, but they're all really interesting questions. I ended up teaching a course on the anthropology of tourism, which was theoretically one of the most interesting things I've ever done, because tourism is so complex. And it's much more than just ethnic tourism or recreation tourism. And it goes through all of these permutations, because the fact is we're all tourists, right? We hate tourists, so. And when I taught my son, I said, you know, one of the things we have to deal with is tourists self-hatred. Anthropologists have, you know, really caught in that, right? Because we're sort of like tourists, but we're not really tourists, we're authentic. But anyway, here's the article, and it's interesting, and here they all are. Most of these were dead by the time I was a kid, although I remember some of them, barely. It's the moderns that I remember, because I grew up in the 50s, and that was the era of the moderns. But they all talked about that, and since my father had a drugstore, he knew all their secrets. I mean, he must have been selling Mabel whatever it was they were taking for syphilis at the time. But she was going out for treatments and stuff. This was all very secret, but I'm sure my father did, because he had a drugstore, right? He had so there they all are. And this is another rendition. And I want you to look at the configuration here. Here they all are, and there's Tony. And this is another iconic thing, is the artist and their beauty, right? And there's so much more to say about the role that Tony played and Mabel played in the creation of modern Taos. And there they are painting. This is actually the Santa Fe crew painting. And this is for Lois' book. Lois was always, I know she was always braided by what I had to say, but she had to accept. And we became friends. Lois had a great sense of humor. And I was sorry when she died, because she was fun to play with. And she was very exuberant, and she was very smart. But I always said, you don't really get it. And this is, of course, a float in the early Taos siesta that has turned the broken wagon wheel into a parade, which is, of course, their wagon wheel that breaks down outside of Cuesta, and they have to carry it into town, and they become, you know, they see this adobe village, and there are these Indians and these Mexicans, and they go, oh my God, you know, this is really authentic, this is really something, and so they stay, right? And it's the whole story of the art colony, and it becomes a myth that they themselves create. And it gets promoted over and over again. Okay, so I grew up surrounded by these paintings. They were everywhere. They're still here in the harbor. These paintings have seeped into my psyche. There's no way around it. Just like the way Taos looked when I was growing up. There's no way around it. I remember a lot of these people. I barely remember Mabel. I certainly remember Brett. You know, it was like, Harvard. They were all over town. There weren't very many galleries then. And of course, many of them are very beautiful works of art, right? I'm not looking at them as an art historian. I'm looking at them as a sort of, what do they tell us about social relations in Taos? And what do they tell us really about the white imagination? That's really the key here in some sense, is because the tourist gaze, a lot has been done about the tourist gaze. What is it that tourists see? And what is it that tourists don't see? And do working class tourists see different stuff from white middle class tourists? And what other stuff? So there's a lot of really interesting literature on the tourist gaze. But anyway, I think what this comes down to is that the tourist gaze, probably everywhere, but certainly here in the Southwest, is a white gaze. And what is a white gaze? What does that mean? What stands out in the white gaze, and what is left out of the white gaze? So I'm going to show you a lot of these incredible paintings, and there is a time because I'm running very slowly here. These are the paintings of many of the art colonists. Just show you, what do you see here? So I'm looking at these not as an art historian, but kind of as a social critic in a way. Phillips. I grew up looking at these. There's a big story behind this one. There isn't time to go into. I mean, these were put on posters to sell the railroad. These were distributed in the East to bring people on the railroad west. What do you see? Now, that one is called Me and Him, and the art book that it came out of claims that one of those is Buford dressed as an Indian. I don't know if I can see that or not. I don't know if that's true or not. But it's called Me and Him. So there are obviously some important differences, different emphases, different kinds of styles among these artists. This, I believe, my theory is that they were building the bricks for Mabel's house, which is right behind the Madonna. She's right next to a Madonna, which she used to invite her guests to go spy on her remotely. They creep into the arroyo and watch. And that was like their entertainment, right? Anyway, I mean, Mabel, where she built her house, right between the Pueblo and the town, for looking both ways. And of course, felt that the Indians, that Taos Public could save the West. I mean, she believed that. And that she brought the illiterati and the artists of her time to come to Taos to interpret this. And to save the Indians, but also to be saved by the Indians. Now we have the others. This is Blumenshine's plaster. As a matter of fact, I think that the complex that Blumenschein put together up the street there, he bought a little at a time from the family village and painted them. Now, this one is interesting. I mean, they're all interesting. There's so much of these paintings. There's so much that we can look at. Look at this. And that's the same setting. And whose house could that be? That's the house of an artist where all of these artifacts are being collected as artifacts, not as saints for altars. In other words, it's like this is the Santiago, right? But he's sitting in Blumenshine's house, probably, looking at these. Famous Penitente procession. sheep herder. I tried to track this down because there's a story behind it, and we'll never know the answer to what really happened here. But this was, I think, Blumenschein put it together. He did not attend the trial. He painted this 10 years after the trial. Something happened in the mountains where a sheep herder was encountered by 3 tourists. One was a semi-local, I think, from a neighboring community. And somehow, the sheep herder ended up getting tried for murder for killing the guy, the husband, and the woman taking refuge. And there was a trial for a sheep herder who murdered a tourist. And this is not the actual trial, but this is a composition that Blumenschein came to based on faces from the roundhouse. It's called Trial for a Sheep Herder. And I've tried, I've talked to people, what really happened up there? I think we'll never know really what happened. But the sheep herder in Taos ended up killing a tourist. And his wife ran away, and the other guy was sort of disappeared or whatever. Now there's a story, but we'll never know quite what it is. He ended up going to prison. And I don't know what became of him. Some people said, well, he wasn't really from here. He was working for somebody who had more land. But anyway, it's one of those stories we'll never know. But I think there's stories behind some of these. And I think Blumenschein, in a way, captured. These paintings are like part of my psyche, because I grew up watching them, and my parents knew them. I knew some of the old art cons, and I knew all the moderns. Just growing up, I used to pour punch at Yuledia Amita's gallery openings. And so, through my mother, I was very much exposed to the art community, and through my father, who had a store on the plaza, 2 doors down from the courthouse. Everything that happened in the house, he knew about. It was very intimate. So, look, one of the things that's unusual about this painting, and you may notice, that none of the paintings are integrated. This is a somewhat integrated painting. And what do you have? You have here what appears to be let's say, a Spanish-American woman who's standing in a doorway, and the Indians are on the outside. There are almost no paintings where you have them together. The paintings themselves are segregated. And also, how are they represented? How are Native Americans represented? Timeless, idyllic, pre-American. And the Mexicanos are all working, all laborers, pretty much. And she's standing in the doorway, keeping them out? Who knows? This is a mix. Probably there's a Mexicano standing against the wall. Probably that's right at Taos. Probably that's somewhat integrated painting. How many of you guys remember Joe Gomez? The Gomez family. They're still a prominent family. This is interesting because what it shows is Joe cleaning burning houses palette. So many of the artists would use well-known people. Some of the faces of Taos people, like Joe Sandoval, like Joe Gomez, became famous from the paintings. And he'd paint them over the course of their lives. And they would model in the morning, and in the afternoon they'd do yard work and domestic work for the artists. And often the people from the pueblo would take on the surname of the person they worked for. Just sort of like, South, in a way. So, and this is, I think this is an incredible painting. There's not time to go into it. I knew Joe, I remember him. He was from one of the famous families, one of the Gomez families, and one of the Peyote families at Taos Pueblo. I knew him as an old man, and he of course became a hero to all the hippies in the Peyote church many years later. And one question you have to ask, why did white people in paintings? And what happens when they are? Why is it, so there are a few, and one is the cowboy. Well, the cowboy is a working class guy, right? So there's that. Dunn's famous for that. This is an interesting painting. Remember Bob Abbott? And I can't remember the name of this individual. The person, the artist who wrote about this, said that this was actually a metaphor for Ufer. Ufer was the only one, I think, who had any politics. He was a wobbly.
And he's famous for his light, right? Burning houses, or Blumenstein is incredible landscapes, really. I mean, some of these works. I mean, I think about, I see the landscape sometimes through the artist's eyes. This stuff was so deeply saturated in Taos when I was growing up. Anyway, this is a broken down. Anyway, the art historian wrote about this is the broken down jalopy is Ufer. And these are his two friends, a guy from the public, whose name I can't remember, and Bob Abbott. And the story is that they scattered his ashes in the Las Cruces Arroyo, which runs all the way behind Naples, past the old Morada, around across the cow pasture and down that drainage, which is a really interesting zone of Taos because so many artists live there. And his ashes were scattered, possibly by Bob Abbott's, from his plane. He was a pilot, and I knew his daughter, I knew his wife. This is Ufer painting himself. And notice there's a ghost in there somewhere. It's hard to make out exactly what it is. My mother told stories about going into Ufer's studio, and his drawings were all over the floor. And he was just painting, and he was kind of a wobbly type. And, and now, of course, Ufer's paintings are worth a lot. And there's your Connie. This is an incredible painting. And when the Harvard announced its centennial, and they used that as its poster, I could not hold back. And so I wrote about it, and said, well, obviously, what it means today is very different from what it meant then. Right? I mean, the meaning of these paintings changes through time as our sensibilities change. But you do have them again. There they all are. And they're in the Harwood. This has got to be one of the front rooms of the Harwood, right? And it's a convention of the time, right? And there's obviously gossip going on. They're all there. There's Mabel, but look who has faces and look who doesn't. And it's a convention of the time. But you notice that these paintings, it's like white people have faces. A couple of the locals who actually are part of the entertainment life of the art colony sort of get faces, but the others don't have faces. The musician, these guys don't have faces. And again, it's a convention, but it's still a thing. And I'm taking these paintings as social documents, setting aside their aesthetic value. What do these tell us about the imaginations that produce them? What does this say about the white imagination? This is about the white imagination. It's as much about the white imagination as it is about Indians or Mexicans or New Mexico. So the enchantment industry is created by these incredible paintings that are commissioned by Fred Barbie, which express the wonder that the artists brought to this pre-modern frontier environment. And the paintings, in a way, know not what they say. And it's like, what you're seeing is these paintings, you almost never see paintings in which they're white people for sure. And what you do, and why not? And I once asked somebody who pointed out, and I said, oh, well, white people aren't interesting. We already know everything about them. I beg to differ. What do we know about white people? And what are white people anyhow? And what are Mexicans anyhow? And what are Indians anyhow? I mean, we all have these very clear ideas of segregated categories, these silos of being, of separateness. And that somehow these silos of difference are the sacred architecture of the land of enchantment. This is the enchantment. And so it lives on. And it's like you can look at those paintings, I look at those paintings as social documents, look at them as social texts. What are they telling you? Are they really telling you about the people of Taos? I once asked Rena Swenzel, who is now deceased, who comes with this incredible family of people from Santa Clara, who are all artists and intellectuals, extraordinary people. It goes on and on. And I said, what do you see when you see the painting? She said, well, one thing, and I thought, is it also means that that's something we can't live up to. Because they're painted in this sort of timeless, primordial, aboriginal way. Maybe there's a course there, and that's not quite Aboriginal, but it's like, this is a pure Indian, unsullied by modernity, the authenticity that the modern artist, the modern tourist is desperate to find. And they're never in the same paintings together. The Indians are timeless, part of nature. The Mexicans are workers. They're laborers. And the white people, so the legacy lives on. This is the light, and I noticed just outside, they have these little plaques now for the art colonists, and there's one on Kenneth Adamson. He was the youngest one, and he was the first to have a residency at the University of New Mexico. And this would have been in the 30s. This is before World War II. And how many of you recognize this? There are these these paintings in the west wing of Zimmerman Library at the University of New Mexico, these murals, which were commissioned by President Zimmerman of New Mexico to express New Mexico. So here we have, this is the first panel, the Indian as artist. Here's the second panel, the Mexican as labor, right? And this is in a library where generations of students at the University of New Mexico have studied under these paintings. And every spring or so, I don't know what's happened, once the Chicano movement got going, the Chicano students would say, these have to be torn down, they have to be destroyed, they're racist, these are racist paintings. Now, this is pre-Los Alamos, this is pre-World War II. And so okay, the Indian is somehow art and an artist. The Mexican is a laborer. And here we have science. And also, check out, where's the mother? I mean, look at this. This is a bird with cleansed of women. Well, there are women peering into, there's one peering into the microscope. But it's like, where's the mother? What happened to her? This is the future. Okay? And this is the future. And so, I mean, it's like, what this shows is that and this was progressive. This was progressive thinking for its time. I once had a woman who, when I gave this talk years ago, I didn't have these pictures. Lois and David would have had heart attacks. I mean, who has the face? Who has the white collar? Who is standing between them? This is the future. And where are the women? It's a world cleansed of women, right? And it's also a world in which there is really that there's these silos of separate identity. You know, the Indian must remain pure. Well, we know the Mexicans are pure, but they are different. And then we need them for labor. And then there's the Anglo, who is looking forward, who's into the future, who stands between them. And I think every spring, once the Chicano movement started up, the Chicano students would have these have to be torn down. They have to be covered up. And one year, when I was first at the University of New Mexico, Chicano faculty got together, what are we going to do about this? All these Chicanos are going to be coming from all over the country to the Chicano Studies meeting, and they're going to see this, and they're going to think we don't know any better. These are an embarrassment to us. So we had a sign that put up that said, these are historical and stuff like that. And periodically, the students, the Chicano says, these have to be torn down, they're racist. Because this is the racial order. This is the racial order of New Mexico. This is the triethnic track. This is the essence of it. And how many generations of students at the University of New Mexico have studied under those murals and been statued? And I think, the paintings have had profound, growing up, I poured, punch at Yelena Amata's gallery openings. I knew all of the moderns. And I was pouring punch. It's like, these paintings are part of my psyche. I mean, they shape how I see the landscape. It's not that way with later generations, but I grew up in the 50s here where everybody knew everybody else. And it was very intimate. And there were not very many secrets, like it was segregated. Now we're coming to the future. And so it's like, when I say, why are there no white people in the paintings? Well, I once asked somebody, and they said, well, all about them? I say, oh, Todd, we don't really know much about them at all. And they're just as problematic and interesting and as heterogeneous as what we call Indians and what we call Mexicans, La Raza, Spanish Americans, Hispanos, Mexicano, Latinx, always a problematic category. Nobody can settle on it. And part of it is, are they white or not? And that's part of it, and there's, I mean, that's one of the issues, right? Where does whiteness come in here? And the problematic position of the Spanish American, which is a kind of whiteness, and the Mexican or the Chicano, which is a term of opprobrium until it became a banner of activism in the 1960s. So when I wrote the paper, I wrote another paper called Art Tourism, what was it called? Art Tourism and the Vanishing Anglo, about how white people aren't in the paintings. And not only that, back in the 30s, they had parades and, which were historical reenactments. And they'd start out, with the Indians, then they'd have the Spanish, and then eventually they'd have the art palm, and the pioneers, and the white people. Sometime in the 60s and the 70s, when all the activism took place, white people were erased from the public culture. And I think that's really interesting too. It's like, you have the parade. What happens in the parade here in Taos, of course, is that, you have an expansion of sort of Hispano-Mexicano, Viseros, Visadores, you have Mexican, you have flamenco, but you don't have the Kearney's art. You don't have the art colony with their, broken wagon wheel anymore. They just vanish. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, all public representations of Anglos just are erased from public cultural representation. Really interesting, right? But they came back since I wrote that. And now this is Canyon Road a few years ago. And suddenly, there are white people in the art. And look what they're doing. And there's Mark Twain. Oh, and then you have these elaborate sculptures of Native American plains kind of style. They're there. That's integrated. So it's like, what are these social documents? What are these times? These incredibly heroic plains figures and white people. But where are the Mexicans? No, the Mexicans are. And this is El Dorado. They're still going on. This is El Dorado a few years ago. Okay. So. I think, Zazova is really interesting. And the story of Zazova is really interesting. This was created by the artists. The artists invented Santa Fe Fiesta, just like they invented Santa Fe style. This is all an invention of the 20th century tourism industry. All the stuff that we think is completely Mexican authentic, it was created by anthropologists and artists, basically, and business people and boosters. And of course, the story of Zazobra was originally that high. And what's the name of the guy? I can't think of his name. The guy who invented it. Anyway, caught on big time. And I had a student who actually did a book on the Santa Fe Fiestas a few years ago. And the part of the fiesta that is claimed most by Anglos is the burning of Zazobra. The religious meaning, of course, and Vicente Martinez, an old friend of mine, used to say, Sylvia, when we talk about Santa Fe, we're just their poor cousins. And we try to imitate them sometimes, like in the fiestas and stuff like that. Because our fiestas are sort of modeled after the Santa Fe, but not really, because we are different. And then it culminates in this burning. And over the years, he looked Japanese during World War II. But when you think about, what can you say about Zazova? Well, and there's new stuff too. Well, for one thing, he's male, right? When he roars, when he's being burned. But he's also white as you can get, right? He is white. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That Zazova is white. And so what does this mean, burning of Zozobra? Is it a purge? I mean, I'm talking here on the level of unconscious symbolism here, right? And the first time I saw Zozobra, which was very late, I thought, this sounds like really sadomasochistic stuff. It sounds really sexy. But I went, I saw it, and it wasn't that. It was a joyous event, but it is really the event that is most controlled by Anglos, right? I think it's the lions or the kimonos. I mean, there's the religious stuff, and of course there's the entrada, which is now forbidden. You know, the whole conquistador thing that finally the Red Nation folks and Pueblos have been complaining about for years. I mean, why should we, you know, participate in this phony celebration of our conquest? And over the years have complained about it. So, well, finally, they got it abolished, and it's still simmering. People aren't happy with that. But that's, you know, Zozobra's. The other thing about Zozobra, somebody pointed out, which is it shows that the meanings of stuff changes. He wears a skirt. So, is he trans? is Zozobra a white trans? I mean, it's like symbols are so rich, you know, but the voice, of course, is very massive, very horrible, really. So, can we free ourselves from the triethnic trap? I see this reenacted conflict and dynamics in Taos and even worse in South, in which the Native American is like this supernatural, spiritually enlightened being. Mexicans are creatures, and they are problematic, and they're labored, and we don't know what to call them, and they certainly don't have a culture we're saving like the Indians do. I mean, you don't really have, there were of course the Santos, you know, and all the penitente fascination, you know, that went on with Mabel having her guests hide in the arroyo to peer at that morada behind her house, which is actually came to be known in the art gallery as Mabel's morada. They would hide in the arroyo to watch the penitentes. And that was like the big activity for a lot of Anglos during the 1920s and 30s. Go spy on them. And then, of course, there's the art there, which became, you know, collected. And worth millions. Larry Frank's collections is worth millions when she finally sold it to the Museum of New Mexico. You know, so it's this notion, it's this idea that somehow the Indian is elevated above, it's like a spiritual entity, not regular human beings. I once asked Rena Swensel about how that incredible family of artists and intellectuals, and said, how did it make you feel to look at the paintings? And she said, well, what made us, for one thing, so we could never live up to that. You know, dressed in buckskin and, you know, pre-modern stuff. I mean, you don't really see, I mean, Ufra you see some, you see actual Indians doing labor. You have some pictures of Indians dressed in modern clothing, but not for the most part. They posed in all of this buckskin for the and a lot of the paintings were based on Ben Randall's photographs. These were highly staged images. They tell you as much about the white imagination as they do about what's going on in the house, because they know what was really going on in the house. So, I don't have any solutions. This is from a book by my colleague and friend Chris Wilson, who did a book called The Myth of Santa Fe. He's a historian, an architectural historian, and very much clued into a lot of stuff. He has a little interlude chapter in that book called Coyote Consciousness. And so, what's the remedy of this, in fact, highly segregated, highly purist idea of what Indians are, of what, of course, Mexicans can never be fully pure because they are essentially mestizo, right? And that's what we call Anglos here. And I think one of the interesting things about New Mexico is it's the only place where we actually have a name for white people. And you know, I guess because much of the literature on whites, which of course is now being banned from, you know, a lot of universities. No critical race theory here. We can't have a theoretical understanding of the race relations in the United States or in the world, because that's really just dumping on the United States. We can't have that, it's not patriotic. Is that there's a name, and I'm just suggesting somehow we speak of Indians as if they are one thing. It's a pure category. Mexicans are problematic because they are intrinsically impure. And then white people are sort of, well, we already know about that. I mean, is that a heterogeneous category? I mean, I hear all the time, Anglos, or what we call here Anglos, say, I don't like being called an Anglo, I'm a Jew, or I'm Italian, I'm not part of that. And it's like, right. That's right. You know, there are many categories of whiteness. And one of the great problematic categories of whiteness is what's a Mexican? Because you're white, are you not white? Lord Gomez wrote a great book on the making of the Mexican-American race, which I recommend highly. She's a New Mexican. Got a law degree and a degree in sociology. She wrote this brilliant book. When the second edition came out, she said, after Trump, Mexicans are less white. So there's the coyote consciousness. So what is the coyote? The hybrid. I mean, what is erased from all of these pure categories is the hybrid, right? The coyote, the mestizo, the mix that we all abhor because we want pure categories. Because enchantment is based on the preservation of pure categories. And there's this notion, well, you will pollute their purity if you mix them. You know, and once you've done that, then the magic is gone. It's like putting a white person in the painting. Once they're in there, the magic is killed. I mean, there's one that I have that I couldn't find, which is a black and white. It's actually a picture of an Indian serving dinner to a bunch of white people sitting in Morada. You would never see that, right? And it's like, so it's what's erased from this enchantment. The enchantment industry is based on a segregated imagination. And we all have a stake in it. You know, I say, I don't know how to get out of it, but I don't see anybody else getting out of it. You know, but we have to think about this. And so what I will leave you with, Nitpankla. This is based on a Nahuatl word that means in between, the in-betweenness. And Pat Mora, who is a Chicana and a poet and an incredible person, has a book called Nitpankla. It's also been taken up by newer, younger scholars saying, well, it's also queer. It's in between, it's mixed, it's hybrid. Nitpankla is the place in between. And it's like, that's who we are, really. I mean, who in here is pure? There's no such thing as a pure Indian. Mexicans, by definition, aren't pure. And what the hell are white people? And it's like, so Spanish Americans, you know, Latinx, I mean, we go back and forth. It's like, what do you look like? I mean, I'm red as white. I don't feel white, but I have the privilege of having been red white. People in my family, many of them are much darker. I mean, I grew up seeing this, aware of this. And that's why when I read Bodine, I said, boy, this guy really got it. Even though it's out of date in some ways, he really nailed the dynamic in which the artists, the art economy, which was a very different kind of Anglo, whatever that is, coming into Taos in the early 20th century, than the ones who had been there before. We're simply looked down on both groups, right? Whereas the artists extolled the Indian, but they never quite were comfortable with the Mexican, because that was the help. I mean, the Indians were the help too, for sure, they argued, but they were noble. They would save America from its corruption, its urban corruption that Mabel so decried and came here to escape. So anyway, that's the revisited part. Thank you. Any questions?
If there are any questions, I can pass the mic around so you can right here. Raise your hand if you've got a question.
I can shout. You were just referencing a book right at the end there. A woman, a Chicana woman that wrote, and she did a second edition, and she had the Trump comment.
Lord Gomez, what's it called?
Lord Gomez.
Manifest Destinies.
Thank you.
Yeah. She's back at UNM. She went to UCLA for a while. It's actually, she's trained as both a lawyer and as a sociologist, and she knows her history. And she talks about how with Americanization, Mexicans become a race, a non-white race. And it's a really interesting, and it's what we call critical race. Yeah.
Sylvia, do you collaborate with anybody in like from Hawaii or the southern U.S. that have the same sort of cultural thing in the Mont Lab?
I don't have long enough a life for that. There was a time when I wanted to work in the South because it is the other great race system. I mean, the Southwest is not named as a race system. Yankees call the South a race system. The whole country is a race system. But what's different about the Southwest, of course, it's not black, white, binary. You know, it's the triethnic. But if you actually start to pick it apart, it's much more plural than that. And Hawaii really interests me because there's so many similarities. And I've been to Hawaii several times, and I had a student who was a native Hawaiian who taught me a lot about the history of tourism and the native Hawaiian movement, and of course now Lahaina and what's happened on that island is also an object lesson in tourism and water and displacement. So there are a lot of parallels. Yeah.
I was wondering, just as a fellow anthropologist, about thinking about zozobra. Instead of reading it straight as like sadomasochistic, white people burning themselves, what if it was like a ritual of inversion, like how the Catholic Church would have with, where they're showing people what the opposite is of the hierarchy in order to reinforce the official.
You mean a ritual of reversal?
Yeah, of reversal, that's what I meant. Yeah, exactly.
I don't know.
You don't know.
The story was that the name of the guy who invented it skips my mind.
Will Schuster.
Will Schuster.
That he saw the burning of Judas in Mexico, and that was the inspiration for zozobra. The original zozobra was just that. And I think you could go to town on that.
Yeah, right.
On zozobra. I don't think that, I've exhausted zozobra by a long shot, but I know for sure they're burning something really black. So you say, what does that mean? Is that sweeping it under the rug yet again? Because you don't really hear much, critical race theory, critical thinking going on about zozobra. But then on the other hand, is it a redemptive thing? I mean, that's the thing about symbols, is they never just have one meaning.
Mm-hmm.
They're plural in their meanings, and it changes through time. When you take the Zimmerman murals, that represented the progressive thought of its time. I mean, that was progressive thinking. When I showed this at a talk once, a woman from the South came up to me and she said, you wouldn't have even had a painting like that in the South during the 1930s. You couldn't even have that. So segregated as it is, purist as it is, and you think generations of students have studied under those murals, and what are the messages that are seeping into their heads?
Mm-hmm.
Indians are artists, Mexicans are laborers, and science is Anglo, but it's also male.
I really enjoyed all of the historical imagery that you presented about Taos, but I'm wondering, change happens, and it's happening all the time, and in our present day in Taos doesn't quite fit into those past imagery. How can we bridge that gap?
You tell me.
Maybe bringing in more of the local artists and getting more community involved into telling their stories, because everything changes, and we can't stand. I mean, I love history, but I think we also have to understand that history has taught us a lot, and there's been a lot of changes, and so we can't say that there is this cultural dissonance, because it's healing on many levels here in Taos.
There has been a great change. And it's like, when I say revisited, it's both changed and not. Because I see the triethnic trap being reenacted all the time. And it's often in an artistic context. It's in the context of the arts. And I think that's something that really needs to be thought about. I mean, right now with the Harwood and the decolonial thing, one of my questions was, and when the notice went out with the paintings, I mean, there's the colony, right? And there's right there in the Harwood, and there are the artists, you know, and there's Mabel, and there they all are. And I said, I had to comment. I wrote, and I said, you know, obviously it has a different meaning today than it did back in, you know, when it was painted by Blumenschein in the 20s. But it's not that different. I don't think it's that different. If you, Taos has changed a lot. But I think this is paradigmatic. I think this is the paradigm for both Taos and South. And that in how we escape that, how we work through that, you tell me. I mean, I think anthropology is really good analysis, but we don't really have the solutions.
Did you know that Uther interviewed Trotsky when Trotsky came to Taos?
I didn't know Trotsky was here.
Yeah, John Nichols and I found out by accident having dinner one night.
Well, Wilford was very interesting. He was claimed to be a Robin, and he was an interesting figure. Yeah, a lot of people that come through Taos and Mabel, hosted many of them, or otherwise. Yeah.
You touched upon, I grew up in this place too.
Right.
I mean, my uncle used to be was a curator, not a curator, caretaker. So I spent most of my childhood here. And a lot of things a lot of things change. I spent most of my life out in Mexico. And you come back and it hasn't changed a whole lot. Case in point, when we talk about change and the place of the Mexican in the paintings. I was playing pool with these guys the other night. I was lamenting that I went to this party. It was all white people. I was what we call Bosca la Leche, the flying milk. And then he said, "Oh wow, that's that happens to me." And he said, "That happens to me," but it seems like since he's been here the whole time, it's like he seems to be that's like a common paradigm. And I wonder, well, is it because part of the whole this triethnic trap is that the really interesting people are the people at the bottom?
Well, of course.
Yeah, and these people, and it says this whole history of who the people, Taoseñas are, which is, the history is really mixed. What people call Mexicans are many detribalized Plains Indians. I mean, it's way more complicated than I think people really want to know. The disinterest in the actual history remains the same.
Right, and I think that clinging to these categories as if they're pure, and as if somehow mixing them will dilute their power. In other words, the whole preservation of the enchantment factor is dependent on segregation. And I call it segregated imagination, because of course we're not legally segregated, are we? But we segregate ourselves. And these paintings are about the segregated imagination. So how do we get outside that? And I think there's a lot of creative work that actually does that today that wasn't around when I first did this paper, and it certainly wasn't around in the 30s, which was the heyday of the art colony before World War II. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that people get around it. But we're still trapped in this notion of three cultures, three people who get along, and yet we don't open it up, we don't examine it, we don't ask, what the hell is an Anglo? Where does whiteness fit in here? Are Spanish Americans white and Mexicans aren't? Where do the Jews come in? Where do the Italians, where do the Arabs come in? I mean, it's like, this is and we have a segregated imagination, which is the core of the enchantment. When I hear this thing, New Mexico true, the news is New Mexico lie, it's a lie. New Mexico true is a big lie. Yeah.
I'm Nicole, I'm the curator here at the museum. I just want to address bringing the Blumenstein here. I'm so glad it's been brought up so many times. The staff actually had many conversations about bringing that work here with full knowledge of your articles, and we decided that it was the perfect piece to bring because it was both truly representative of our history, which is problematic as an innately colonizing institution as a museum, and also a great jumping off point for conversations like this, particularly bringing you here. And in fact, the label next to the Blumenstein in there actually quotes your article and asks everyone to consider the questions that you pose.
Yeah, no, I bet when I saw that, I couldn't. They're putting this out there for the Clinton tenor, come on. Or the Quattros or Simpson, yeah.
Oh, way up here? Yeah. Yeah, I have a burning question, or a burning opinion, which is that 50 years ago, my grandfather, John Hernandez, told me that we are Mexican American and we come from old Mexican families of New Mexico. Okay, I know about Mexican Americans being looked down on. I was told that by kids in the schoolyard when I was a kid in Oregon, of all places, bright white. Okay, so independently of my parents and my grandparents, I figured out why we're looked down on, because we're losers, in Trump's words. We lost that war. We lost this vast swath of rich, rich territory. And if you really understand the history, you know that it was a fight started by Texans and that they manifest destiny and all that stuff, that it wasn't that, Mexico did something against the US. So, Trump just capped it all for me and sent a shiver down my spine when he came down the golden escalator and said, Mexicans are rapists, this, that, and the other. Okay, you're talking about my cousins, right? And I realized, now, he picked up on it. It was in the current. Mexicans are losers, that's it.
Well, so they're not white. Are they not? It depends on, used to be, east of the Mississippi, they were white, west of the Mississippi, they weren't white. But Laura Gomez in her, new edition says, since Trump came down that escalator, they're not white anymore. Because that's the ambivalent, ambiguous position.
Sylvia, wasn't it a promise in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the residents of New Mexico, et cetera, were always going to be described as white in the census?
Well, the census categories have changed over time. I mean,
Sure.
the most famous things are the articles in the treaty that assured people their land and water. And of course, that was violated. I would recommend Laura Gomez's book, which she's a legal historian, is looking into the sort of how it happened legally.
So in the 1850 and 1860 censuses, my ancestors are shown as white. People were either B, W, or R for red. Easy, right, for a census taker.
Right, no, the census categories shift around. And,
Yeah.
Cordelia?
I just have a quick question, Dr. Rodriguez. In your lifetime growing up here, as I compare it to mine, when we talk about tourism, for you, have you seen shop owners, gallery owners, and the numbers of the racial ownership of who gets to own those spaces? Has that changed in your lifetime, or do you feel the percentage of who those spaces are purchased, leased, owned by, are similar to 2023?
I haven't studied that. What I did years ago, I wrote a paper on the Fiesta, on the plaza itself, which is an volume on New Mexico Plaza. And at that time, I used some of the early information on who owned the buildings in the plaza. And of course, owning a building in the plaza is different from having a business on the plaza. My father had a business, but he didn't own the building. And looking at the earliest 20th century, and then looking at when I wrote that paper, which was probably in the 90s, it was actually pretty stable. But that's not the rest of the town. I mean, the plaza is now just a theme mall for tourists. It's no longer the beating heart of this community. And I think it's a source of great grief for the local people. And I think that's one, and this is getting off, I think that's one of the significances of the Taos Fiesta, is that it's a reoccupation of the territory from which we have been erased. But I don't know now, but what I found was that the breakdown at the time I did that study had remained fairly stable, but that's just for the ownership on the plaza. And there's only 2 or 3 people who really own it. Yeah.
We'll take time for one more question.
So thank you, Sylvia, for having this conversation. I think it's so critical. I'm Juniper, I'm the director of the Harwood. And I guess I want to just challenge us all as we look at who the storytellers are in our community, including institutions like the Harwood, or sign placards on the plaza or at Carson Park. I mean, all those narratives that tell the story to our tourists and to visitors and to our residents. Let's challenge ourselves to look at those more critically and look at where those biases are. Just in that painting where it looks almost invisible, but if you look more closely, those biases are there and they're pervasive, and we perpetuate them with our actions and our storytelling. And so we all have to, I think, come together and be critical of how those stories are told. And I think Taos can actually make a difference in how that narrative is and complicate the narrative into a more true story.
Right, no, it's a trap and we're caught in it. And it's like, let's figure out how we get out of it. I'm not sure. I think Coyotismo, I think Nepantla are maybe hints. But, and then there's plenty of art today that breaks that down. But it still operates. It is still alive and well. And until recently, as I said the other day here in the Harwood in this room, I thought Santa Fe was much worse than we are, but I don't think that's true. I can give you ethnographic descriptions of settings in which the trap is being entered as we speak, despite our best intentions. It is a trap.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. The galleries will open here in just a minute. You're welcome to look around the museum for the next 30 minutes. We welcome you to continue the conversation as well. Thank you so much for being here today. I'll be right back.
Another reference.
I was going to